special events and performed in Revolutionary War reenactments. George had the opportunity to be the MC for the ceremony commemorating the establishment of the U.S. Coast Guard founding, which was on C-SPAN, and was invited to be an expert on a panel discussion about Hamilton Gage National Memorial grand opening at the Museum of American Finance. Let's give a warm welcome, although quietly on Zoom, to George Tonkin.
So it's really an honor. It's almost like so real. You know, I graduated from there and I get to do this program. Who would ever thought? But there are national parks in New York City, and there's Herbie there. He's looking over behind him, the Brooklyn Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge in Manhattan. And if you ever go to New York, you can't remember the three bridges, BMW, that's how I remember them. And there I am, that's about 2018, maybe. That's Wall Street. It's around the holiday season, and there's a Christmas tree right across the street from where I'm standing. That's where I worked at Federal Hall National Memorial. Was the stock exchange, which opened in that location in 1903. What we're going to do here today is talk about Alexander Hamilton. And here's a portrait of Alexander Hamilton. And basically, we're going to talk a little about his childhood, go on to the American Revolution, the Federalist period, and of course, probably the most famous thing most people know him about is the duel with Aaron Burr. So there's some of the topics we'll be talking about. If you do have any questions, I guess my partner crime will check out the chat once in a while. And if as we go along, if you have a question, please be free to just put it right into chat. Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is quite an interesting place. Most American history, unfortunately, we only talk about the 13 colonies, but after the British defeated the French during the French and Indian Wars, there was really 27 colonies. A good example, Canada was a colony, but many of these islands in the Caribbean, in this picture here, were basically owned by the British, French, and the Dutch. The British were late on the scene to the Americas, but they eventually get in here. Alexander Hamilton, his mother's name was Rachel. She would marry on St. Croix. Then there was a falling out. She would leave him and go all the way down to Nevis. That's where she was actually from. And that's where she would meet her future husband named James Hamilton. James Hamilton was a fortune hunter. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out with him, but he has a son born in 1755 named Alexander Hamilton. Unfortunately, there's a debate going on. A lot of people think he's born in 1757, but many historians prove he was born in 1755, and even some are saying 1754. They would eventually go to St. Croix. In between, they would stay at some of these islands here. And so they don't know where he was born to. So most people say Nevis, but he could have been born on one of these islands too. But they eventually end in St. Croix. They end there. They end in St. Croix. And then in 1768, his mother dies. So Hamilton is an orphan basically because his father took off before that hand, but he wrote something about a hurricane. He wrote poetry. So he almost got like a scholarship to come to New York, and that's his next journey. So in 1773, Alexander Hamilton ends up coming to New York. Here's a picture of him, one of the earliest, but right over here you see people fighting. You got to remember a lot of things were going on in the colonies after the stamp tax crisis. And this is technically the first blood drawn in the American Revolution happened right in New York City, where Hamilton's coming into, happened in 1770, about 3 months before the Boston Massacre. So so that's an important event in American history. A lot of people don't know this event. It's called the Battle of Golden Hill. So Hamilton's coming into the town at the time. There's a lot of things going on in American history. And this is the Port of New York. Of course, Hamilton would never seen this, but if you come into New York Harbor today, that's just how it looks. So Hamilton would come into New York. He would land right about here, Murray's Wharf. This is Wall Street. This is what New York basically looked like. How New York gets its name, it gets from James, the Duke of York. His brother was the King of England. He gave it to him. He never visited here. The first European country that took over what we call New York today were the Dutch. So the Dutch were here from about 1609 to about 1664. And then the British would take over, rename the town in New York, and Hamilton would step right here in 1773. He was going off to Princeton, and that's in New Jersey, but this is what it looked, the dock would have been right about here. This is the NYC ferry terminal today. For about $4, if you ever come to New York, you could ride on these boats. They're basically commuter ferries today, but this is where Hamilton would have landed. And right down here, once again, Hamilton lands here. And this is the Merchant's Coffee House. This plays a lot of his significant events in his life. And if you've seen the musical, everyone's seen the musical, hopefully. The opening scene is that's the opening scene for that musical, where Hamilton's coming off the boat, coming down into Wall Street area. But the Merchant's Coffee House is very important in Hamilton's life. A lot of things are happening here. A lot of gossip goes on. Newspapers coming from the Caribbean or Europe would be dropped off here. Printers from the town would actually go there and ask if they could have the stories, and then people would read about what's going on. Unfortunately, when we think of the colonies, don't think they're thinking going westward. They're thinking eastward. This is where everything's coming from. So this is a royal colony. So Hamilton steps off into this society. New York at the time had about 20,000 people. That's about the size of, I guess, Las Vegas, New Mexico today. Today, there's almost 9 million people. So when he's stepping in here, everyone knew each other. So these merchants' houses play an important part. This is basically how it looks today. This is where my arrow is. This is where the merchant's house would have stood. Right over here was a Starbucks, quite funny, right in this location. But this was it. This is looking east on Wall Street. Hamilton then would go off to New Jersey. He would end up back in New York because he didn't think he was getting a pretty good deal, which is Princeton University. So he ends up going back to New York and he registers for King College. Today, that's called Columbia University. So Hamilton, as you see, he's getting involved in 1774 and in 1775 with protest pamphlets. And then eventually, we have Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and George Washington is appointed as commander-in-chief of the Continental forces. So Hamilton, he basically forms his own militia group. This is where that college would have been, King's College. And if you look at my arrow again, King's College is right about there. There's a background of King's College. So once again, right here was King's College on this map, and that's the background from it. And one time, that's how it looks today. So Hamilton is involved in training troops, militia units. Eventually, he's appointed. He fights in the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Brandywine. So he's really involved with Washington. It's not until March 7th, 1777, he becomes commander-in-chief for George Washington. where he did a lot of his trainings is at St. Paul's Church. Unfortunately, everything in Hamilton's lifetime in Lower Manhattan does not exist. This structure you actually could see today. This structure still stands. It's survived two major events. Here's the steeple here. It's survived the fire of 1776 and 9/11. 9/11 will be just back this way, a few feet away. So once again, that's where my arrow's on the map where St. Paul's Church stood. It was considered a country church. So Hamilton would do a lot of practicing here with his militia units. One thing you could, if you come to New York, you could actually see this fence. This fence is basically protected a statue of King George III. On July 9th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is read in New York, so Hamilton actually witnesses that. Then a bunch of them ran downtown to this Bowling Green. This is the oldest park in New York City, and they tear down the statue of King George III. And if you see where my arrow is, right on top there, these little crowns they actually removed. So if you ever go to New York, you see this fence, it is from that time period. And you could actually feel where the cut marks were. So they tore down this statue of King George III. It was gold leaf. They tear it down and they melt it down for 40,000 musket balls, 40,000. And they were used to basically shoot British redcoats. They did an archaeological dig out in Morristown, New Jersey, where a big battle took place, and they actually found metal from this statue of bullets. The tail of the statue is at the New York Historical Society. The reason they put the statue up, most Americans didn't have any idea what King George III looked like, so they put him here. So you imagine this huge statue on a 14-foot pedestal, quite intimidating for people, but they tear it down after they heard the reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York. Today, the statue would stand right where that fountain is, and the location of that statue, we see my arrow on the map, is right about there. So you actually could see the location where that statue came down. So Hamilton joins the military. He fights in, once again, major battles. He would end up meeting his wife in 1780. He has a falling out with Washington, but Washington re-signs him up and he becomes a captain, and he is at the Battle of Yorktown. And this is the surrender of Battle of Yorktown. So the war basically starts in 1776. It doesn't end till 1783. He comes back to New York in 1784, and he moves to 57 Wall Street. This is a high-end hotel today in New York, but Hamilton would be living, here's Wall Street right about there on this historic map, and 57 Wall Street on the map, see my arrows right about there. So he ends up moving back to New York. He's a lawyer. He does it pretty quickly because he was an ex-veteran. This picture here shows you what Wall Street looks like, what the buildings look like, comparatively to what I just showed you. So you see Wall Street's changed a lot over the last 200 years. The most important thing, I think, at this site where Hamilton's living, he argues the Rutgers-Waldenton case. Why this case is so important is a judicial review. Basically what happens, New York State passes the Trespass Act. If you supported the British Crown, they were called loyalists. They could take your property away from you. What happens is somebody owns a brewery, Rutgers, you ever hear Rutgers University, same family. They want their brewery back plus money. And Hamilton represents the loyalists, and they rule in Hamilton's favor. Of course, this upsets a lot for Hamilton, but this is very important to our law in this country today, judicial review. Basically, they're saying that the federal government can rule over state governments. So we signed the peace treaty of Paris, and the state of New York can't overrule that we're not supposed to take property away from loyalists. He starts a bank at the same time as 1784. At the time, end of the war, we had no currency, we had no banking, no companies whatsoever. So Hamilton starts a bank in New York called the Bank of New York, and it would have been right at this corner. The plaque is right there. And he lived right across the street, so he had pretty short commute to his bank. And this bank is the first public company traded on the New York Stock Exchange, the Bank of New York. This is what it looked like when it opened. The only thing about it, if you were not a Federalist, you were not going to get any money loaned to you. So if you wanted to start a business, it was pretty tough at that time. And this is, I guess, the first indication. This is Aaron Burr when they start butting heads. Burr decides, I'm an anti-federalist. I don't really believe in this real strong government. We got, rid of the monarchy now. The federal government's going to be strong and raise taxes. So he starts his own company, a bank, as a water company. New York had a yellow fever breakout. He comes up with a great idea. He's going to bring water into the town. Hamilton actually signs off on it. But when Burr submits it, he changes some stuff after Hamilton signed off on it, basically saying any money left over could be used to start whatever he wanted to do with it. And he does start a bank. And that bank is located at 40 Wall Street, right here. And that bank and Hamilton's bank were next to each other for almost 100 years. And today we call it Chase Bank. Ironically, Chase Bank owns the dueling pistols. So Hamilton and Burr knew each other. They're like a ship on a course, and they end up crashing into each other. So that's probably the beginning of this feud. Eventually leads up to a duel. So Hamilton is, living in New York. He realizes this Articles of Confederation is not working, and they have a couple conventions, and they agree on to have a convention in Philadelphia, Constitutional Convention, and it takes about 100 days. I think that's the most amazing thing about it. And here's Hamilton whispering to Ben Franklin's ear. And the most important person in the whole convention is George Washington. Everyone trusts him. Americans trust him because it's a very secret conference. Hamilton, unfortunately, comes from the state of New York. The governor of New York sends 2 more delegates. So anytime Hamilton will be overruled because the other 2 delegates were not into the Constitution. So the Constitution, once again, took about 100 days to write. It's ratified in 1787 and then sent out to the states for ratification. The big thing Hamilton does, he writes something called the Federalist Papers, which most people have read them, but Hamilton writes the Federalist Papers to explain what the Constitution is. And as you know today, everyone has a different opinion about the Constitution. So it's sent out, and New Hampshire makes it the law of the land. And the first thing they do is, of course, pick George Washington as our first president of the United States. This is the Indian Museum today. This is in Lower Manhattan, right where the statue was. And when New York State ratifies the Constitution, they actually have a parade for Hamilton. Right here is the old fort. That's where that Indian Museum stands today. And right over here is 1 Broadway, and there's the fence, the famous fence I was talking to you about. That we're actually going to rename the town Hamiltonian because people really loved Alexander Hamilton getting this constitutional ratified. They have elections. And of course, George Washington is nominated as our first president of the United States under the Electoral College. He wins every vote. And this is Federal Hall. This is where I used to work. I was standing right over here, if you see my arrow. And this statue of George Washington represents about the height of the balcony where George Washington took the oath of office. This is City Hall. So they would take the old City Hall, it was a Georgian style architecture, remodel it into Federal Hall. George Washington was not going to be sworn into a Georgian style building named after King George III. This is Broad Street. So on this balcony, George Washington will take the oath of office. If you go back to that first picture, that is that height of that balcony. So this is Broad Street today. Stock market's right there. There is Federal Hall. It's basically the same picture I showed you. And that's where Federal Hall on that 1776 picture would be. It's located right about there. So there's George Washington being sworn in on the balcony. This is Trinity Church being rebuilt after the fire of 1776. The Bible, they scrambled for a Bible because they didn't know how to swear in a president. And the other funny story is that George Washington was late to his inauguration because they forgot to send someone to pick him up. So it was about an hour late to his inauguration. Hamilton, unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, he takes the oath of office as the first Treasury Secretary on all days, September 11th, 1789. That building behind you that's Francis Tavern, because they really didn't have anything set up for the government yet. So that's where Hamilton would start meeting. And one of the biggest plans, Hamilton's financial plan assumption, basically the federal government would take over all the state's debts. Another big plan, a national bank, excise tax, that'd be like on whiskey. We have the whiskey rebellion, and protective tariff to protect American businesses. So these are the four big plans. So Hamilton is really trying to get the country on firm footing. This is another illustration of Francis Tavern. And then in the musical, the room where it happened, hopefully most of you have seen the musical, there's the plaque, and this is the location where it would have happened. And what happened in this, this is Maiden Lane. What happened with the room where it happened, Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson come up with this proposal that the federal government would take over all the money of the debt from the American Revolution, like $90 million. But the capital would have to be moved out of New York and where it is today in Philadelphia. So that was the agreement. So the capital leaves New York, and Hamilton, the country's going, and this building here is the first brick and mortar building for the New York Stock Exchange. Hamilton did not start the stock exchange, but he set up the framework. 5 of the first trades on this market were Hamilton related. The bank, of course, and all those government bonds. They were trading this out on the street. So someone finally figures maybe we should have our own building. So it's called the Tonkin Coffee House, much more fancier. Once again, this is where the location is today, than the Merchant's Coffee House. When Hamilton shot in the duel, they actually put a bulletin board up there telling everybody how Hamilton was doing. So Tonkin becomes the New York Stock Exchange. Hamilton, once again, leaves government in 1795 and heads back to New York because he's not making a lot of money. And this is 26 Broadway. This building here represents that. That would be right about there, right nearby where the statue of King George III was pulled down. So he moves back to New York, and he's like, here's 26 Broadway again. And 26 Broadway would be right over in here. So he resigns. He's not making enough money. He becomes a corporate lawyer. And he loved writing pamphlets. And one of the pamphlets he wrote about Marie Reynolds, he had an affair with her. And Jefferson didn't believe he's having an affair, not because he's having an affair, that a man of that intelligence would have an affair and give money to somebody. He thought he was stealing stuff off from the government. And Jefferson didn't even believe this, but Hamilton talks about it. You actually could read it. It's online. It's about 90 pages long. Hamilton loved writing. One of his biggest mistakes, he loved writing these long pamphlets. He wrote one about Adams when he ran for president. So Hamilton writes this. So what Hamilton does, eventually, he's so confused, I guess, or he wants to make it up to his wife. He builds a grange. This was his house in northern Manhattan, and I actually worked here. This is Hamilton Grange today, his home here. One of the most interesting things about it, to save money, if you look on the side here, the boards aren't flat because you're entering this part of this house. So this is his country estate. And then in 1800, of all people, Jefferson runs for president again, and Burr is tied with him. And you can see some of these quotes that Hamilton's calling him immoral, dangerous. So once again, these are 2 or 3 more incidents where Burr's getting hit by Hamilton. He starts writing for the New York Evening Post. That paper still exists today. He started that paper. And then November of that year, his son Philip is killed in a duel with George Eckert. And then 1802, the family's in the Grange. And this is, if you look behind me, that's the office. That's Alexander Hamilton's office. You actually see this house. So the duel, it takes a while to happen, but basically 1804, April of 1804, Dr. Cooper hears a quote that Hamilton says. It gets into the local newspapers. And if you look, just go down each one of some of these things are pretty interesting. You can't call someone a puppy, a scoundrel. He was called a liar, I guess, because he called them trusted. That's a big word. The thing about dueling, everyone had to be equal. Like someone from a higher class can duel someone in a lower class. So these are some of the things in this dueling. And it started in April of 04 and ends in June 11th, 1804. That's when Hamilton is shot, and he would die a day later. That happened in Weehawken, New Jersey. He would end up dying at this house. And you got, there's a plaque to where he died at the location. But final 2 slides, this is his wife here. And if you read in red there, never forget that my husband made over the government of the United States of America. She ends up moving to Washington, D.C. eventually. But she lives to the age of 97. So she lived a long life. And you could actually see this, his grave marker here. Before the play of Hamilton came out, you might get 4 people a day looking at this. And as you see, there's a tourist group right behind it. So hundreds of people come to this site. Angela Church is buried there. She was in the play. Hercules Mulligan's buried there. He was mentioned in the play. His wife is right here. And his son is technically might be not in the grave, but they have a marker for him. And finally, these are some of the things you could think about now when you're thinking about Alexander Hamilton. There is New York, the sun rising up on it. And this was Hamilton made. He made what our country is today is more about Alexander Hamilton, how he realized we need a diverse economy. And he realized America was like Hercules in a cradle. It was going to keep growing, like the great state of New Mexico. They weren't even thinking about the state of New Mexico. But as the country kept growing and growing, a lot of those institutions that Alexander Hamilton set up are still with us today. Any questions?
I'm going to check the chat really quick. I don't see anything at this time. Is there any questions? Going once. Let's see if anyone has it. I don't see any hands up either over here. Well, George, thank you so much. When I Hamilton, before or right as it was becoming a musical. I read that. It took me quite a while to enjoy that book. I immediately became a Jefferson adversary because I love and adored everything that he did. He had such a brilliant mind. So thank you for taking us on this tour with you through
You're
New York
welcome.
experiences, and we really appreciate your time today. If there's no further questions, that will be the last of the HU talks for today, but please join us tomorrow where we will be starting again promptly at 9 a.m. And that presentation lineup, I apologize, I dropped my script. So tomorrow we'll be having an HU talk with Dr. Rod Rock, Community and School Collaborations, that will start right at 9 a.m. in this room, same Zoom channel. We'll see you then. Everybody have a good evening. And again, thank you so much, Ms. Crawford.
You're welcome.